All right, thank you for the invitation to give this talk. This is a presentation on training machines to identify species using GBIF-mediated datasets, and my name is Serge Belongie. This talk has 3 parts, so before I get to our mediated strategy discussion, which is part 3, I'm going to give an overview of my group's work on a project called Visipedia, which is largely a supervised learning endeavor, and then move on to a less supervised version of that kind of fine-grained analysis in part 2 with something called SNAC. So for part 1, let's talk about the Visipedia project, which is really focused on fine-grained visual categories. So the Visipedia project focuses on subcategories. So for example, if you look at this diagram of birds, you can see the shape of the beak or the bill is very interesting in these different cases. And as a casual observer, you may know how to differentiate these, but you may not know the specialized terminology for those parts or attributes of birds. So we developed Visipedia with this in mind so that it would be possible to capture and share the visual expertise of different communities, in this case for birding. So we want to tap into this kind of enthusiasm that different communities have. It might be for lemurs, it could be for biplanes, and we want to make use of those large repositories of images and labels, and most importantly, the community energy that exists around these different topics. At the heart of this idea is that certain tasks are easy for humans but hard for computers, and vice versa. So if you look at the left, looking at that image, it's pretty easy to tell it's not a chair. And a lot of off-the-shelf methods these days will be able to tell you that that's an airplane. The task in the middle is a lot more difficult for lay people. So asking whether that is an indigo bunting or a blue grosbeak, that's actually a pretty difficult question. But the task on the right, if we're able to break it down like a field guide into parts and attributes like color of the belly or location of the beak, then we can make it easy for the average observer. So this brings us to one of the early Visipedia approaches that we developed, which is called visual 20 questions. So the idea with visual 20 questions is that you have an input image that enters the computer vision block. So this represents whatever the current state of the art is in computer vision. And we have a posterior probability given the input image. And if the computer vision block is doing a great job, we would have a large spike here for the correct species of the bird, and the rest of these bars would be quite small. And the concept with the visual 20 questions, where humans and machines work together, is that the computer vision block does the best it can, and then that kicks off a biased game of 20 questions where the human observer is engaged in the process and asks and answers strategic questions. And the approach behind visual 20 questions is that we want to maximize the expected information gain. So in this case, we have a set of questions based on attributes and parts that are enumerated in advance. And we can prepare a large amount of training data that has those parts and attributes annotated. So based on that training data, when new images come in, we can estimate which question would be most effective to ask at any given iteration. So one interesting thing about this, because it's now maybe 8 or so years since we developed that method, is that computer vision block that we were using was using old-fashioned techniques, meaning before deep learning. So we have a fun term that we coined to describe stuff that was before the flood of deep learning papers, basically before 2012. So we call this antediluvian. It's a play on the word antediluvian. So the older members of the audience might know about things like histograms of vector quantized filter responses or shape contexts and bag of words and so on. Those are the kinds of things that our community used before deep learning got really big. And we developed some of these approaches that were hybrid at the time, that still required some localization of parts and attributes, and then synthesized those together into a larger embedding vector, which was then categorized. But I think the trajectory of this work is such that this general line of work is that eventually no part detection was needed at all. So where we started was with these anti-depluvian features, and eventually it just became a game of collecting as much data as possible. And in that diagram, I showed that the computer vision block does its thing, and then it's followed by a couple, maybe 2 or 3 questions that are asked to a human user. Overwhelmingly, you don't even have to do that anymore. So in principle, it's still important for us to keep that interactivity. But for the most part, with modern deep learning architectures, it's really about collecting high quality data. So the Visipedia project kind of transitioned into an effort to tap into human communities of knowledge with stratified expertise. And this led to the creation of one of our large bird data sets between Cornell and BYU and Caltech. And one of the first places where Visipedia used its technology for identification was for bird ID. So the Cornell Lab of Ornithology has an app called Merlin Bird Photo ID. And this is the web version. And you can see at the time we still had to identify some parts. And then you make use of geolocation, time of year, and then you can get a short list back, which in this case, the short list was of length 1. And it doesn't automatically go into the training set for that species. It's presented to the user. If you think it's correct, you tap on "This is my bird." It'll play the bird song, and then it goes into a bucket where a suitable expert for that species can decide whether to put it into the next training run. So this became a very popular app, and it's now available for free. So you can download Merlin Bird Photo ID, and you can download different packs right onto your phone. So you don't need to have a data connection to use this in different regions. So this led to us, the Visipedia team, and many collaborators in industry and in academia to create a series of workshops, the FGBC workshops, and many of you attending today have participated in these workshops or the challenges that we've co-organized. And so it goes well beyond birds to things like flowers or wildlife camera traps, also man-made things like fashion, clothing, apparel, and so on. So we've done this for several years, and it allows us to tackle some really interesting problems, like the finest of the fine grained, like the ladybugs here that only differ in the number of spots. Also, a very familiar problem with this audience is the long-tailed problem. So you can see that something like a monarch butterfly has a massive amount of training images, but these more exotic insects over here might just have a handful. So that means we need to work on techniques like few-shot learning, also domain transfer. If you have a novel data set, for example, of moths and butterflies, but you already have a domain like birds that's well established with good pre-trained networks, then these kinds of competitions we've been running provide us lots of empirical opportunities for checking source domain similarity and exploring strategies for fine-tuning deep networks. And the next collaboration that Visipedia had after birds was to work with the iNaturalist app from the California Academy of Sciences and National Geographic Society. This is an app that runs in the cloud. Other than that, it's similar to the Merlin Bird Photo ID app, but you can download this app and it has tens of thousands of species from around the world. And it yeah, it sends the image up to the cloud and then gets back species suggestions that are both visually similar and, if possible, seen nearby. And ultimately, the user of this social network, iNaturalist, will indicate what looks like a good match. And then that again goes into a kind of staging area where people that have proper training for that taxon can decide whether to add it to the training data. So that's just a quick overview of what we did with a couple different collaborators for Visipedia. But as I mentioned in the beginning, it's really a supervised effort. These are cases where the labels are well known if you have an appropriate expert that can provide them. But there are a number of cases that are more exploratory in nature. So, for example, you might just want to browse a data set of birds, or you've seen a bird, but you don't have a photo, and you want to be able to look through some kind of visual representation of this taxonomic group and find something that matches. So in this case, what we're focusing on is capturing a notion of perceptual similarity. For example, saying, well, I don't know what the name of this species is, or this one, but they look pretty similar, and they look more similar than either of them to this bird over here. So we'd like to capture that notion in some way. Now, as many of you know, there are very straightforward ways of capturing similarity between pairs of images. For example, a Likert scale, which can use 5 or 7 steps. And you can present a pair of images like these two. This is a pizza dish, and this is something pizza-like. I don't know the name of it. And you can present a statement. These two foods taste similar. And then a human volunteer can click on this disagreement to agreement scale. The problem here is that you can get kind of burdened by these questions. What does 3 mean? What does 4 mean? Your opinion can change as you go through a batch of these questions. There can also be drift, and you need to calibrate between different users. And when you see something that's a dessert and then you see the raw carrots, it's just tricky. You're just not sure what it means. So instead of going with a Likert scale approach, we make use of this triplet-based method, which makes use of comparisons. So in this case, we at minimum, you need to have 3 images in order to do a meaningful comparison. And what we did to make it more efficient is make use of something called grid questions. In this case, we call it a 9-choose-4 grid. So we have an input image on the left, which shows carrots. We have our grid of 9 images over here. And the user is asked to click, in this case, on the 4 images that look like they would taste most similar to the carrots on the left. So in doing so, the images from that gallery or grid get reorganized so that you can form these triplets where in any triplet, for example, containing this carrot, this dish, and this pizza, we know that any of these pairs have higher similarity than anything formed from here to these carrots over here. So the grid is just a kind of parallel visual processing trick for harvesting lots of these relative similarity triplets it's just an efficient way of grabbing lots of those. If you were just to do these nested for loops, presenting many, many triplets of these types of food, we just found it gets really boring for the human users. And again, the human visual system is very powerful at parallel processing. So it's easy to get lots of these triplets. Now, again, in this setting, because we don't have labels, we want to deal with notions of perceptual similarity without knowing the name of the species of the bird or the name of the cuisine. We just want to capture notions of similarity. So traditionally, the supervised problems are where our community has focused. And as we know, you can take a supervised problem, for example, for cuisine classification, train a deep network, and then peel off that final layer and just get some kind of, for example, 1,000-dimensional embedding vector, which can be used to capture relative similarity. Now, if you have the names of all these cuisines, then you don't need this exploratory technique. But when it comes to food, you may not know the name of the cuisine. You may just be hungry and you want to eat something that looks good and looks similar to things you've eaten before that you liked. There's also food that can be in different states, like frozen or cooked. Context is also important in ways that may not be apparent at the beginning. So texturally and in terms of color, this could be guacamole or wasabi. And that would be quite a surprise if you got it wrong and you dipped a chip in this and ate a mouthful of wasabi. Now, human observers are able to see the context and probably get this answer correct. But again, that may not be apparent in the original supervised training setup. There's also these kinds of cuisines that cross between genres. So this is a Kit Kat bar, which is traditionally chocolate, but it's flavored like wasabi. Where does that fit into the food taxonomy? It's unlikely that you would have that as one of your known categories in advance. There's other examples where almost the same item of cuisine can pop up in completely different cultures and end up with different names. So what this brings us to is an algorithm that we call SNAC, which stands for Stochastic Neighbor and Crowd Kernel. And it's best understood as combining two different techniques, one which is pairwise and one which is based on triplets. So first, the pairwise approach, which is the more conventional part, is shown in this part of the pathway. And it is based on T-SNE. So for those that haven't heard of T-SNE, it's student T-distributed stochastic neighbor embedding. And it's a very popular approach for taking high-dimensional data and producing traditionally two-dimensional embeddings that represent it. So with T-SNE, you would take your set of food images in this case, run it through a deep architecture, get out the 1,000-dimensional vector, and run T-SNE on it to get an embedding that looks like this. So if we ignore the human expertise pathway at the top, it's really just about extracting high-dimensional embedding vectors, running this dimensionality reduction technique, and observing the low-dimensional embedding. In the case of SNAC, we bring in the crowd kernel, the human expertise. And for that, we make use of an algorithm that's related to T-SNE, which is called T-STE. T-STE stands for Student T-Distributed Stochastic Triplet Embedding. So it's a very similar algorithm, but it makes use of these relative triplet orderings. Now, these human expertise ratings are expensive in terms of time and money. And we actually can't get them in as exhaustive a level as we can for this pathway down here. So in fact, it's just for, say, 0.1% of the possible triplets, we get that from this human expertise pathway with the grid-based questions. And because it's relatively a small number of these orderings that we're grabbing, we can combine it into a cost function that has both T-STE and T-SNE and T-STE added together with some weight. And we can adjust that weight so that the human expertise impacts the low dimensional embedding that we produce. So this by itself would just produce the kind of pixel-based features that would lead to some kind of concept embedding. But the human expertise pathway, it has the ability to pull on that embedding and move things around according to subtleties of human perception. So if you take, for example, the Food 10K data set, you can produce this visual map that shows cuisines near one another if they have similar apparent taste, like these berry-based desserts or waffle-like breakfasts and so on. And you can do more quantitative things by taking, for example, a bird data set that has been labeled by experts, you can take all the images of the birds, present it to users with the grid-based interface with no labels whatsoever. So it's a purely visual job for non-experts, and run it through Snack. And then at the end, put back the color coding to indicate the ground truth that was provided by the bird experts. And when you look at this, you might find certain dots that look like they're out of place. So this dot right here appears to be something that an expert labeled as different than the ones around it, like maybe it came from this cluster. So in a case like that, we can actually look up the corresponding image and then find out who tagged it from our team of experts at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And we showed it to them, and it turned out that they had made a mistake. They just hit the wrong button when they were labeling it. So they were an expert, but everybody makes mistakes sometimes. And in this case, the mistake was caught by a layperson that simply judged similarity of images without knowing what they were called. Okay, now moving on to part 3, which we call mediated machine vision. This is really about bringing this kind of technology to a broader audience. So what you've seen so far, the concrete outputs I mentioned in part 1, those were focused on a group that did bird recognition, and then another group from California Academy of Sciences that focused on plant and animal recognition. But they still have a kind of regional focus. And one of them comes from Cornell, the other comes from California Academy of Sciences. How do you bring this kind of technology to a global audience? In principle, you could say, well, everyone should just use Merlin Bird Photo ID if they're interested in birds, and just add all your data to that effort. Or the whole world should use iNaturalist, and then everyone would have that same app. Well, that's just not how things work, because there are lots of museums and herbaria and citizen science efforts around the world that organize in different ways. And they still may want to use that kind of machine learning functionality that we talked about, but they would like to do it on their own, or have some important differences in how they approach it. And toward that end, GBIF, which stands for Global Biodiversity Information Facility, provides some very helpful infrastructure to make it possible. So GBIF is it's a global organization. It's headquartered in Denmark, and it has dozens of countries around the world that contribute to it. In particular, the Merlin, eBird, iNaturalist, and thousands of other organizations around the world push their data to GBIF on a weekly or monthly basis. So in that respect, GBIF represents a registry, or a kind of an archive of, and has pointers to all these different efforts around the world. So GBIF itself is not a citizen science effort. It's not making bird recognition apps. It is a registry where it's kind of a one-stop shop where you can do geo queries and find all the endangered species within a given rectangle and so forth. So they have tens of millions of records with images. And one of the things they provide that makes them a really valuable collaborator is mechanisms for citation and attribution and clarity around licensing. So the idea here is you can take that basic technology that I showed you for bird recognition and plant and animal recognition, and provide it in a way that all of the members of the GBIF network can use it, and they can tune it to their liking based on the data licenses or permission to do wipeout or update new versions of data sets and so forth. So this is just showing the variety of images that you'll find. They're not just these in the wild photos. You can also have herbarium sheets or x-rays, hand-drawn images, and so on. So the specific workflow that we're proposing, we call it mediated machine vision. This is developed between Visipedia, Google Research, and GBIF. And the specific part of Google Research that's helping with this is the TensorFlow Hub team, which is based in Zurich. And the idea here is that a group that's a member of the GBIF network, for example, that works on moths and butterflies, they notify GBIF that they're interested in having a data set package for use in this workflow. And then, for example, it could be 1,000 species of moths and butterflies. And so then GBIF, which already has the pointers to all of the multimedia data for that data set, assigns a DOI to the data set, which is the digital object identifier. And that's something that can be cited unambiguously. And then researchers at Google or Visipedia can select an appropriate deep learning architecture, for example, ResNet 50, and train it, produce the model weights, and then the contributor of the data set can publish the data set and the model on TensorFlow Hub or TF Hub. And that then is assigned a DOI as well. So the data set gets a DOI and the model gets a DOI. And then third-party developers, for example, can make use of that model, and they can go to a page that has information about the model and a visualizer. So you can have a third-party app developer that doesn't know, doesn't have detailed knowledge about pattern recognition. They can look up an appropriate model, for example, for mushroom recognition, use a drag and drop interface to check how well it works. They can see performance characterization. And in this example, a group called Svampe Atlas or Danish Fungal Atlas developed an app. It started as an effort within an FGBC workshop, and then they became a publisher in this workflow that I showed. So they trained a model, put it on TF Hub, added documentation for it. Every TF Hub page also has a provenance graph, so you can see where was the model pre-trained. For example, it could have been pre-trained on ImageNet. It could be Inception v4 pre-trained on INAT 2018. But in general, you can see the provenance graph for the model. And when somebody uses the model and cites it, you can go back and see exactly what data it was trained on, what are the performance curves associated with it, and so forth. So this is still a work in progress, and we're looking for partners to join this workflow. And you can go to this GBIF page and see more about how to join the effort. And there's also a mailing list. And with that, I'd like to conclude and thank my collaborators at Cornell and Caltech, as well as BYU, GBIF, and Google Research. And specifically, I want to thank Google Research for supporting this research from the beginning. And thank you very much for your time.